Welcome to a new lecture. In this lecture, we're going to look at how we can start understanding evidence-informed approaches. And what this really means is that we're going to look a bit into critical thinking and why you'll be a better practitioner for having done that. Because there is a vast difference between those practitioners who just take things for granted, who read an abstract in a journal paper or research paper and just take that for what it is, and those who don't take things for granted. They are skeptical and critical, and they've developed a way of thinking where they can pick and choose things that are relevant and contextualize to the people they're working with. So for this lecture, we're going to look at two specific parts. In the first part, we're going to look generically into what critical thinking is and how we can apply that to our practice. And then in the second part, we're going to start looking a bit more into the hierarchy of evidence and also actually debunk the fact that sometimes it's not case studies. Case studies aren't necessarily bad. And of course, systematic reviews, as you're going to see, is the highest level of evidence, but that doesn't mean that things like case studies or cohort studies are bad. So that's the second part where we're going to look a bit more into that, because that is really important to remember. So what I would like you to understand first and foremost is that when it comes to nutrition, when it comes to training, in general, there is a lot of things that add up to the end result. And that's really important because a lot of times we just take nutrition for granted. People think that we just eat nutrients and therefore we have to prescribe 2.3 grams of protein per kilogram body weight because X. And unfortunately, it's not necessarily that simple. And I don't think we're doing our clients justice when we're just looking at the fact that we're talking about macros and micros, and we forget about this whole context and relevancy aspect of our practice. So I want you to keep this little, I suppose, equation in mind where there is a lot of things, lots of things equals nutrition and results. And in order to be able to debunk and break down what lots of things actually means, we got to start by critically appraising the literature that we read, the discussions that we have, and how we are looking at things as practitioners. Because that is often the hardest thing that we find, is looking in the mirror and asking ourselves, did I actually do that because I wanted to do it and I believe in it? Or did I do that because it's the best for the client at this given moment in time? So with that in mind, let's look at the brief overview for this two-part lecture. And we're going to start by defining evidence-based and evidence-informed approaches, because they are slightly different, and I believe it's quite relevant for people, especially younger professionals these days, to keep the two differences in mind. And then we're going to start looking at the hierarchy of evidence and a bit more into relevance and context around that hierarchy of evidence in the second part. But today we're going to look a bit more into critical thinking before we start defining what these two different approaches actually are. So one thing that we hear a lot is that professionals are talking in absolutes. Let's say the squat as an example. Some people say that you have to squat wide. Others say that a closer stance is better. But I don't think we can simply say that either of those is the best. And the reason for that is that it depends on the person. What if, as an example, someone gets pain in their hips or their knees if they got a really wide squat stance? What if that wide squat stance isn't actually necessary for that person and puts them at risk of developing injuries or just overtraining? What about the person who's got really bad ankle mobility? Is it bad for that person to do a half squat instead of a full squat? Or are we just working with what we currently have? So I don't think when it comes to those claims that we should just automatically assume that one is better than the other without actually questioning why we're doing it and doing so in context of the people or the person that we're actually working with. And then people always ask, what foods should I eat to burn fat? Should I eat more carbs or less fat? And what about my protein? And is it only calories in versus calories out that matter? I think a lot of these statements are portrayed in a way that's not necessarily beneficial for a lot of people, in the sense that people are trying to oversimplify things too much. And it doesn't mean that we should overcomplicate things either. But in order to solve a lot of the issues and challenges that a lot of people face, we're going to have to start educating them in a very, very simple and I suppose easy to understand kind of way. And another thing we see as an example here is you see it primarily in women, unfortunately, where, let's say a lot of the women want to lose body fat and they're walking on the treadmill or sitting on a bike doing a lot of cardio, which, by the way, is a really good thing for that. And all of a sudden, they're chugging down on Gatorade and different sports drinks and so on and so forth, where that itself might not necessarily be the best thing. Why should they use that? Should they take it because they're really low in energy, or should we look at their whole nutritional profile and approach before we prescribe that? And if we do prescribe that, are we aware that that could actually shunt the use of fatty acids as a fuel source during training and therefore possibly create more of a negative effect than what we would have? And what about this fella here in the middle? He is bending over, but is he bending over because he's tying his shoelaces? Or is he deadlifting this way? If he is deadlifting this way, everyone's automatically going to jump to the conclusion and this is really bad for you because your back is rounded. But what we don't know here is whether or not that barbell weighs 80 kilo, 300 kilo, or it's a broomstick. If that is a broomstick and he's using that for a warm-up as an example, that's probably going to be rather beneficial for him just to get the mobility in his spine really well, possibly before deadlifting. The reason I've put that photo up there is that we can't tell. You and I, we just don't have enough details right now to tell whether or not that person is going to deadlift really heavy. And therefore we cannot make a conclusion just based on that quick little observation. And as we alluded to about 5 minutes ago, we're talking about the hierarchy of evidence where, everyone just says that, that was a case study, that's a really shit study. But what if you're working with an Olympic athlete? And as you could imagine, Olympic athletes are really, really hard to do big studies with over time. So it could be that the only thing that we could get there is actually a case study. And let's say that you're working with an Olympic boxer and you wanted that person to get really good results, but the only thing that was out there that was, remotely similar to the person you're working with was a case study. And if that case study was really well written and the person got really good results, then can we say that that case study is good? Absolutely. I would rather take that case study because I can translate that into something practical that I can use with my client instead of a systematic review of multiple studies that were done in sedentary people looking to lose weight. Because that study does not translate to the person that I'm working with. let alone the studies that are looking at the different mechanisms that weren't even meant to be translated in the first place. And then, you look at things like MCT oils as an example, which is medium chain triglycerides. And the claim here is that they improve performance and speed up fat loss and so on and so forth. And to my understanding, there is only one review paper out there that has looked into this and found a modest positive effect of MCT oils on fat oxidation. But that study was done in obese people who didn't do much activity. So even then, without looking deep into that paper, we can ask ourselves and we can question whether or not we can translate that evidence into people who are a bit leaner and people who are more active. It is very likely that we cannot do that. And then, let's talk about the placebo effect. It's a real thing, it's out there. And especially when you're working with people who are a bit more serious about things, let's say that you have a person who's really serious about lifting weights and going to the gym. If that person is currently taking BCAAs, branched chain amino acids, during their training and they're feeling really good and they're getting, some really good training in because of that sensation that they get from taking it, even though the supplement doesn't have any direct benefits for muscle growth, what would happen if you actually took that supplement away from them? It is very likely that just because they believe in that supplement, they would actually perform a lot worse if you took it away. So then the overall training effect and the result would actually be less than what it could have been because we removed the placebo effect. So even though you might not have a lot of evidence behind it, it's important that we critically appraise that in context of the actual person that we're working with, so that we're doing them the most benefit and good. And then what about protein intake? We always hear, especially in the bodybuilding literature, that people should consume between 2 to 2.5 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. And I think for a lot of people that's a really good range, but I don't think it's worth it as a blanket statement to absolutely everyone, especially not to people who are extremely active, such as endurance athletes or fighting athletes, combat athletes, where the need for carbohydrates is so incredibly high that eating 2.5 grams per kilogram of protein might actually see them consume a lot less carbohydrates than what they need. So maybe overall, they would actually get better results if they consume, let's say 1.6 or maybe 1.8, and sometimes maybe even a bit lower. So I think one thing that we're going to have to ask ourselves is, is it really that bad, or is it true? Are we looking at this with skeptical eyes, or are we just taking it for granted? And this quote here by Guy P. Harrison kind of sums up what I've been trying to share with you and get across in the last 12 or so minutes, where skepticism means having a healthy dose of doubt and using reason to differentiate between what's real and what's not real. Skepticism means being open-minded and holding back beliefs until there is enough evidence to back it up with. That quote there nicely summarizes what we've just spoken about. So let's use a couple more examples to look at how important this is to actually do. So as a nutritionist, a lot of people who practice as nutritionists, they get their clients to do food records or food diaries or whichever one, it could be any kind of inventory method used to track food intake. But what they're not necessarily aware of a lot of the times, unless they're dietitians, is that these food records aren't necessarily that accurate. And the reason for this is that different macronutrients and micronutrients they differ in the amount of time we need to record food for in order to get a relatively accurate viewpoint. So one example here is that if you just want to look at average energy intake, you do it over 3 weekdays and maybe 1 or 2 weekend days. But if you want to look at something like vitamin C, you need to do it for more than a month. And the other thing that we need to look at when it comes to, food inventory methods, we also got to question whether or not these guys are changing their behaviors based on the fact that we are wanting them to actually do these food records and complete them and send them back to us. Maybe even if you do it in person, they're going to alter their answers based on your bodily responses, the way you hold yourself, as an example in that conversation. So there's a lot of really important aspects to consider when it comes to even just food inventory methods. And this is something we're going to go through later in the course. And what about physical activity? People always say, when you go to the gym, you burn 500 calories. When you go for a walk, you only burn 90 calories, or whatever the fuck they say. And what a lot of these professionals don't realize is that it's a pretty tricky thing to actually measure. And biologically, there are a couple of things that you will come to realize later in the course that are actually almost creating a bit of a set point in terms of the number of calories people expend every day just as being humans. And on this little overview here, what we're seeing is the bottom sort of grey, the light very grey area here, that's BMR, that's the amount of energy you expend at rest. Then up here, the little darker grey area, that's DIT, and that's dietary induced thermogenesis. And that simply means the amount of calories you expend by breaking down and absorbing the food that you eat. And then in the middle here, the darkest area, that's physical activity energy expenditure. So what you can see here is that if we drew a line and we averaged out all of these men that have been measured, so there's 90 middle-aged men that were ranked in the order of how many calories they expended every day. If we were to draw a line in the middle here, where we're looking at only their BMR, what we're seeing there is that the average BMR would probably end up being between 1,600 to about 1,800 kilocalories per day. And then, which is very common. And then you see that, the amount of food, the amount of calories expended from the amount of food people ate isn't necessarily that different either. But what is very different though, as you can see here, is the amount of energy that someone expended just simply from being physically active. So one thing we can draw from this is that yes, physical activity makes a big difference in total daily energy expenditure. Things like mowing the lawn, taking the rubbish bins out, going for a walk, parking a bit further away, staying physically active, playing with your kids, going to the gym, all these things really add up long term, where it looks like the person who expended the most here in terms of total calories from activity is looking at looks like it's almost between 1,500 to 2,000 calories from exercise, whereas the lowest is only about 600 to 800 somewhere. So being physically active makes a huge difference in terms of total kilocalorie expenditure. But at the same time, guys, we can't just say that being active for this amount of hours expends this number of calories, because It depends on so many different things. And you and I, we don't have right now, as we sit at home, or as we may be in an office, or if you work at a university, or somewhere where we actually have access to these measurement tools, you won't have access to those measurement tools so that you can put someone in a chamber and measure exactly how many kilocalories that they burn. So we got to critically appraise what a lot of people tell us. Let's relate it to physical activity. Let's look at a kilogram of muscle. People say that muscle burns a lot more calories every single day. So if you put on 10 kilograms of muscle, you're going to burn another 1,000 calories. That is not the case. 1 kilogram of muscle adds 6 to 10 calories of total daily calorie expenditure, not thousands, 6 to 10 kilocalories. So someone who gains 10 kilo of muscle may only burn maybe about 100 calories extra at rest every day. Now, the other thing there is that the person with more muscle is probably more likely to stay more physically active compared to someone who is sedentary and quite overweight or obese. That's the other side of the equation. But simply saying that building a lot of muscle burns a lot more calories is not actually accurate or true. So moving on, what about calorie intake? You know, we prescribe meal plans based on a couple of simple equations that we use, and then all of a sudden we think that all of that is going to be absorbed. We think that that magical number of kilocalories is going to make a huge difference. And what we tend to see is trends of clients almost beating themselves up and getting demotivated because they hit 2.3 grams of protein that day and not 2.5 grams per kilogram of protein that day. And that's a really sad thing, because I don't think that would make a huge fucking difference long term, not even in the short term. And what we have to do as practitioners is really question how accurate this whole calorie thing is. First and foremost, are you using an average value on, let's say, calorieking.com.au or maybe MyFitnessPal to track this? And then we also got to ask ourselves, if we're looking at a label, how accurate is this label? And then what about things like gut health and how many of those calories are actually going to be absorbed in the gut? So there are a lot of things we're going to have to consider when it comes to just even calories alone. It's not as straightforward as just saying eat this number of calories and you're magically going to lose weight. On paper, yeah, absolutely. In theory, no. In practicality though, when it comes to context and circumstances, absolutely not. So here's an example. Here's an example meal of one of my elite fighters, where this is breakfast after a fasted morning training with only caffeine and water in the body. All of that aside, can you tell me how many kilocalories that is? I doubt you can, because you can't see the oil that we use to cook it with, and you can't really see whether or not the vegetables are drizzled with a bit of olive oil or other condiments. What about beverages? Did he drink milk on the side? Did he have water, orange juice? What did this person drink? You can't see that in this photo. Did he have something else after this one photo? Who knows, maybe. And does this person have any gut issues that we're working with a clinical dietitian and a doctor with? Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. These are things that currently in this lecture you're not able to tell. And you have to critically appraise this when you get this from your clients. If they're sending you photos as a means of recording their foods, you're going to have to be a bit of a detective and ask questions like this. It could be, Shauna, with this meal, it looks fantastic, it's super delicious. Tell me, how much oil did you use? Maybe she replies, I used what was in the plan. And then you ask, well, what was in the plan? And then she might say 1 tablespoon. And then you look at her plan, it actually says 1 teaspoon. So being a bit of a detective, asking key questions is really, really important when it comes to critical thinking and using this in a practical context with our clients. So to wrap that section up, we cannot say that it is as simple as just calculating calories, kind of throwing together a couple of meals in a meal plan and hoping for the best. That's only the starting point. Once we've estimated the starting point, calories, the energy expenditure, and so on and so forth, that's all we have. We just have a starting point. And then, based on how they're progressing and, subjective feedback and objective feedback, then we got to titrate calories up, titrate calories down. Maybe we have to change some food timing, maybe some macronutrient distributions and things like that. It could be that after dinner they crave something really specific, like chocolate or something similar. Why is that? Maybe it was the pasta they ate that, was a trigger food. Or maybe we should then look at eating potatoes instead of pasta, or rice. Or maybe just a bit less pasta. Or maybe the person hasn't told you that they haven't slept for 2 days. So with this in mind, guys, let's make sure that we look at things and we critically appraise them for the importance of making sure that they are as practical as possible. So I want you to understand now that being evidence-based is not about just looking up a research paper. It is about being critical, and you need to understand the scientific method, which we're going to start laying the foundation of now, and questioning everything in light of the context in which it is applied. So working with an elite athlete compared to an average person who just loves going to the gym is very, very different, and we need to consider that. So to almost start wrapping this up, the scientific method isn't about proving someone or something right, and it's not about your own personal beliefs or preferences, but it's about creating a hypothesis and being as objective as possible to see whether or not this is the way of getting the results that we want. So to set the tone for the next part of this lecture, we can therefore say that an evidence-based approach is very mechanistic in nature. We tend to just find things that describe a specific mechanism, but we fail to consider the broader scope of all the circumstances with the person that we work with. And this is fantastic for someone who works in a lab, and that's their job. But for us as practitioners, when it comes to being evidence informed, we need to look at all of the papers and all the knowledge that's there, but we need to also pay attention to how that is translated into practicality for the people that we work with, and therefore consider the broad scope of all the circumstances that apply to that individual. So 2 little statements here for an evidence-based approach. It's kind of like, here's an evidence stating X, therefore when I implement this I will get Z. And if we look at that with an evidence-informed approach, it would be something in the lines of, here's an evidence stating X. Let me look into this more and see if it's relevant to the person and all the circumstances that apply to that person. So you're not taking anything for granted, you're looking further into it and how relevant that is to the person you're working with. So for the next lecture, this is what we're going to look at. We're going to start working our way through the hierarchy of evidence, and we're actually going to contextualize each single part of this hierarchy. It is true that systematic reviews are the top level evidence, but we cannot forget about case studies, and cohort studies can be very beneficial as well. And this is all in light of relevancy and context, just like we have discussed over the last half hour. So that's it for part 1. Stay tuned for part 2 when it comes out next week.